Good afternoon. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads, and we're reading Poppy by Avi, pictures by Ballou Floca, published by Orchard Books. And we are on chapter 14, on the way to the house. Remember, Poppy's on her way to check out new house. The old porcupine moved faster than Poppy thought possible, body swaying from side to side, quills rattling like a snare drum. The trail Aerith took was narrow but smooth, avoiding hills, tangles, and fallen trees. From time to time, Poppy saw other animals: weasels, a raccoon, a ferret, and once a bear. As soon as they caught sight of Aerith, they hurried away in haste. Poppy wandered along after Aerith, pausing now and again to gaze upon the endlessly enticing forest with delight and amazement. In low places, white ground mist eddied gently, while above, in the high trees, the early sun sowed golden sparks among dark leaves. But once, while Poppy was staring wide-eyed at a particularly towering tree, she caught sight of what appeared to be a brown blur swooping among the pines. Her joy melted. "I think Mr. O'Cox is following," she called to Aerith. Aerith, however, did no more than grunt and press forward. Poppy caught up with him, and from then on stayed as close as possible. But with every third step, she glanced back. Finally, she actually saw Mr. O'Cox. He was high above, gliding through the treetops on widespread wings like a silent phantom. "He is following!" Poppy cried. "Bug brain," Aerith mumbled. Then, no matter how much Poppy searched, her neck grew strained from so much turning and twisting. She lost sight of the owl. At last she decided he had gone. More relaxed, she paused now and again to take in the forest views. It was while she stopped to sniff a Scotch broom plant that Mr. O'Cox, out of nowhere, made a dive at her, talons flashing. "O'Cox!" Aerith bellowed. Without looking, Poppy leaped toward Aerith for protection. The porcupine, for all his bulk, whipped about and lifted his tail, prepared to strike with his quills. Mr. O'Cox pulled up short and, hissing venomously, flew aloft and vanished. "That was close," Poppy panted. She was trying to see where Mr. O'Cox had gone. "What made you notice him?" "Poppy, if you think there's anything that's going to keep me from that salt, you don't know me." Once more, the porcupine trundled along the path. "Aerith," Poppy panted, straining to keep up, "I'm certain Mr. O'Cox wants to keep me from New House. There must be something he doesn't want me to see." Aerith stopped abruptly and gave a snort. "Poppy, some creatures aren't worth trying to figure out. If they bother you, what I say is swat them with your tail." "Aerith, not every tail has quills." "You're right. I shouldn't hold yours against you." He set off again. "Aerith," Poppy said after a while, "if I could just find out what it is that Mr. O'Cox is frightened of and tell my family, I wouldn't care what happened to me." Aerith laughed sarcastically. "Even if it kills you?" "Well, no, but Poppy, if you don't stay alive, the only thing you're good for is maggot mash." As they traveled farther, Poppy noticed that the trees were growing less dense. There were greater varieties of flowers, too. As the brightness intensified, Poppy guessed that they were reaching the northern limits of the forest. "Aerith," she said, when we get out of the woods, where will we be?" "First, there's a dirt road and an old barn, then a field of corn. Beyond the field is some low grass, then the buildings where the people live. There's also a new big barn. That's for chickens." "What are people like?" Poppy asked. Other than pictures in magazines back home, she had never actually seen humans. There she is talking with Aerith. "They don't bother me." "Did they dance a lot?" "What's dancing?" "It's gliding, swirling, dipping, and sliding with someone you like." "You are strange," the porcupine said. "Now don't try to distract me. On the short grass, not far from the cornfield, is the salt lick. You figured out a way to get it for me yet?" "Aerith, I haven't even seen it," Poppy answered. "It's beautiful, Poppy," Aerith murmured. "Really beautiful." They had reached the northern edge of dim wood forest. Beyond the last of the trees, Poppy saw a dirt road. Even farther was a dilapidated barn, smaller than Gray House and considerably older. It stood on the edge of the field, leaning over slightly. The field itself was full of tall stalks bearing plump and tasseled ears of corn. Tossed by a gentle breeze, row upon row rustled and whispered with heavy ripeness. Aerith trotted across the dirt road. "Come on, move it." the porcupine scolded once he looked back and saw Poppy on the other side. I'm checking for Mr. O'Cox, Poppy called across, though since the owl's one attempt to grab her, she had not seen him. Deciding he was either gone or hiding, she darted across the dirt road and rejoined Aerith. Let's go, the porcupine cried, and plunged into the cornfield, beating his way through the stiff stalks. Poppy paused now and again in his wake to snack on fallen corn, which lay about in great quantity. Compared with the fallow fields the mice scoured near Grey House, the provision of food here was a marvel. Back home, the food the family had access to took long hours to find, and there wasn't that much of it. Here was food enough to feed a family twice their size. Was it this rich field that Mr. O'Cox wished to hide? Did he want her family to go hungry? All that searching for food out in the open did make them more vulnerable. There, Aerith cried, when they finally burst through the far side of the cornfield. Look! Poppy sat up. Before her was a neatly cropped grass lawn. Not far from them stood a smooth, shiny pole as high as a cornstalk. It was capped by a large block of white salt. Isn't that something? Aerith whispered. Poppy glanced at her friend. He was drooling. Now that Poppy could see what she had promised to bring Aerith, her heart sank. How in the world would she be able to do it? It was perfectly clear that even if she could manage to get the salt off the pole, it was too huge for her to carry. The problem itself was too huge to carry. With a sigh, Poppy looked farther. Beyond the salt lick was a white house. It bore some resemblance to Grey House, but its paint was bright and its windows were newly curtained, signs that suggested that people were living there. Was this what Mr. O'Cox didn't want them to know about? Poppy turned to the left and saw a red barn. It was considerably larger than the house, but had only a few windows. The roof was highly pitched and covered with sheet metal. At the front of the barn, the roof jutted out to form a door hood. Poppy gasped. Sitting right below the overhang near a large closed window was an owl twice the size of Mr. O'Cox. Chapter 15, Alone Again. Aerith moaned softly. Isn't that the most luscious thing in the whole world? He asked, gazing at the salt lick. Poppy, whose eyes were fixed on the enormous owl, could hardly speak. It's awful, she barely squeaked. Aerith turned to her. What are you saying? He demanded. Look, cried Poppy, trembling as she pointed to the owl on the barn. Aerith turned, looked. Never noticed that before, he grunted. In wonder, Poppy murmured, Mr. O'Cox is only half that size. Aerith shrugged, then went back to gazing at the salt. Well, girl, he said, have you figured out how you're going to get that salt for me? Poppy, still in a state of shock, managed only to shake her head. Aerith took one last loving look at the salt and turned. You know where to find me, he said. Don't let me down. With that, he began to waddle away. Aerith, Poppy cried, her fearful trance broken. Wait! The porcupine peered around peevishly. What now? He grumbled. You aren't just leaving me here, are you? What else am I supposed to do? Help me? Poppy said in a small voice. Poppy, we made a deal. I'd get you here. You'd get me that salt. I've done my part. Now you do yours. But, no buts, Aerith snapped, lashing his tail in irritation. Poppy backed away. I'm going home now, but I'll be waiting. With a final glare, he said, keep your promise, furball, and marched off. Poppy started to run after him, but tripped on something and fell flat. When she got up, Aerith had disappeared among the corn. An unhappy Poppy dusted herself off. It was then that she noted what had tripped her. It was one of Aerith's tail quills. When he flounced his tail, it had fallen out. Poppy picked up the quill gingerly. She'd never really looked at one closely before. It was mostly black and made of long, fused hairs, just as Aerith had said. One end was blunt. The other end, the sharp end, was ivory white. With fascination, Poppy examined the tiny barbs. The point, which she was able to unresist touching, was frightfully sharp. She was about to toss the quill away when she had an idea. Grasping it by its blunt end, she swished it about a few times. It moved nicely, like a sword. Poppy found a tall blade of grass, plucked it, and tied it around her waist in a sash-like fashion. With care, she slid the quill under this belt. It fit comfortably. Then she drew the quill out a few times to see if it came freely. Though a single quill was not the full arsenal that Aerith carried, it was something. She only hoped she'd never have to use it. Reluctantly, Poppy turned her attention back to the enormous owl on the barn. The bird had not moved, but was still sitting on its perch, gazing off into the distance with huge eyes. Poppy was relieved it had not turned her way. The realization that at any moment the owl might turn and discover her made Poppy retreat into the corn, but not so far that she'd be unable to peer out. Once hidden, she tried to make sense of her situation. It was all very well to have reached Newhouse, but now that she'd arrived, she still had no clue as to why Mr. O'Cox would not permit them to move here. All she had seen was this huge owl. Could his reason have something to do with that? There she is with her new sword. Poppy tried to think it through. An owl of this size would be ferocious. Perhaps Mr. O'Cox was worried that this bird would steal his food. It certainly would eat a lot. The truth was, and Poppy forced herself to acknowledge it, this huge owl made moving here impossible. Mr. O'Cox was bad enough. This owl looked twice as bad. Then Poppy had a new thought. Was Mr. O'Cox really trying to protect her family? Had she been wrong about him all along? But then perhaps this owl was not really living here at Newhouse. Simply because she was seeing it now proved nothing. Could be passing through, perhaps just spending the night. The sun was up now. Poppy decided she had best settle in and wait to see what, if anything, happened. Chapter 16. The Truth at Last. It was some time before she sensed movement in the house. It appeared as vague forms stirring behind second-floor lace curtains, then shifted to the windows below. The front door opened. A tomcat poked his head out. He looked around, stepped outside. The door shut behind him. He was a large, bony orange cat with the pinched body of advanced age. One ear was bent. He walked slowly, limping slightly, glancing up at the sun as if to measure its warmth. But by keeping his tail high, he maintained a stately dignity. Poppy held her breath. Surely the huge owl would notice the cat and realize the old beast had little fight in him and less speed. It would be no trouble at all for the owl to snatch him up. Nonetheless, the cat continued to saunter casually toward the barn. He stopped once, then twice, to scratch himself stiffly under his chin. When he reached the barn, he sat directly below the owl. Squinting, he looked into the sun, then lay down and closed his eyes. Through all of this, the owl did nothing. It made no sense. But Poppy kept watching. The cat slept. The owl remained motionless. The field of corn rustled. Once again, the house door opened. This time a human emerged, a boy. In his hand he held a long stick with a string and a small hook attached to it. Momentarily, he stood on the threshold of the door, apparently listening to something being said from within. He nodded and shut the door. Then he started off on the same path the cat had taken, toward the barn. Poppy, who had never seen a real person, watched with fascination. Surely, she thought, the owl would fly away the instant it saw this human coming. Big as the owl was, the boy was much bigger. But though the boy drew nearer and nearer, the owl remained motionless, its open eyes fixed on something distant. The boy reached the cat, bent it over, and patted it. The cat flipped its tail, but continued to sleep. Then the boy looked up at the owl. He showed not the slightest surprise to see it there. Instead, he put down his stick, went into the barn. With the barn door open, a few chickens strutted out, clucking and pecking the ground. They paid no mind to the cat or the owl, nor did the owl consider them. Poppy was completely baffled. What could the owl be looking at that so held its attention? The next moment, she was even more startled to see the upper barn window open, the window right next to where the owl was roosting. It was the boy who opened it. Even so, the owl did not budge. More amazing, the boy reached out, placed his hand on the owl, and turned it about so that it now faced in a new direction. Never had Poppy been more astonished. Could it be that this huge owl was not real? Was it only a fake? Certainly seemed so, but after all, she had made but one observation. What she needed was proof. To get it, she would have to wait at Newhouse and watch. Poppy stayed on the edge of the cornfield, but her time was not all spent waiting. She was too excited to remain in one place. Instead, she took time to explore the old barn at the edge of the field by the dirt road and found it a respectable addition to Gray House. As for food, Poppy had never eaten so well. It was as if she had first believed there was enough in this cornfield to feed her family. In fact, all of them could move there. During her hours of watching, Poppy met with no other small animals. At first, she was perplexed. Then she decided it was because the fake owl was successful. It had frightened everyone away. Not that Poppy put aside her porcupine quill sword. She remained sufficiently wary to keep the sword at her side. Once, she almost used it. At midday, she was trying to take a needed nap when she suddenly heard something coming through the corn behind her. Taken by surprise, she leaped up, darted behind a cornstalk, and drew the quill, ready to defend herself. It was a family of deer, a doe and 2 young fawns. Though to Poppy, even the little ones seemed enormously tall. Even so, they had not the slightest interest in her. Instead, the animals threaded their way through the corn and approached the salt lick cautiously. With the mother standing guard, the fawns took a few delicate licks of salt until, at a silent signal, they all bounded away. As Poppy tucked the quill back under her sash, it occurred to her that she might enlist the deer's help in bringing the salt to Aerith. But from the way they had enjoyed themselves, it did not seem likely that they'd be willing to take the salt to the porcupine. No, she would have to find another way to make good her promise. Besides, the questions about the barn owl were more pressing. As far as Poppy could tell, it had yet to move on its own. Though Poppy was fairly sure it was a fake, she had to be positive. That afternoon, Poppy thought of a way of getting proof. The old cat was still stretched out where he had begun the day. The more Poppy observed the cat, the more certain she was that he was too old to be dangerous. She decided to ask him about the owl. The notion made her a little nervous, but she convinced herself that keeping her quill sword at the ready would be enough protection. With considerable care, she crept out of the cornfield, all the while eyeing the barn owl, just in case. Did not move. At last she was standing before the sleeping cat, close enough to feel the wash and smell of his fish-scented breath. He was snoring. Gripping her quill tightly, but using her friendliest voice, Poppy shouted, "Hello!" The cat opened one eye. "Hi there," Poppy said. "Howdy," the cat murmured, although he had now opened both eyes. Did not move. "My name is Poppy." The cat sneezed delicately. "Bless you," Poppy said. "Thanks," returned the cat. "They call me George." Poppy nodded. "Nice place you have here, George." "Pleasant enough," George replied. Well, that owl sure keeps things quiet around here," Poppy offered. "Owl?" "The one up on the barn." "Oh, right. The fake one," said George. "Does the job," he said. "What job?" Poppy asked carefully while trying to contain her mounting excitement. "Keeps everybody away, even other owls." "How do you know?" "About 2 weeks ago, the people here put in some chickens. First day, some big old horned owl snatched himself one. Next day, the people put up that fake owl. About 2 days later, I was watching. That real owl came back for another chicken. I saw him dive, saw him catch sight of that fake owl." "What happened?" Poppy asked. Then she held her breath. "That owl put on his air brakes so fast he flipped right over himself. Must have been scared silly," the cat said with a mostly toothless grin. "Funniest thing I've ever seen. And I'll tell you, that was the last time I've seen that owl around here." The cat closed his eyes. "Mighty funny," he murmured. Poppy could hardly keep from grinning. "Nice talking to you, George," she said. "Have a nice day." The old cat sighed and resumed his snoring. Poppy all but skipped back to the cornfield. Despite her excitement in proving the barn owl was fake, she made herself settle down and think things through carefully. The owl was fake, but Mr. O'Cox believed it was real. Afraid of an image of himself, he was probably fearful that he would no longer be the one to rule over the mice. But, according to Aerith, Mr. O'Cox was not really a ruler. That was a lie, just as it was a lie that he was protecting the mice from porcupines, whom he actually feared himself. In fact, the owl was full of fears. Suddenly, a whole new idea burst upon Poppy. Was it possible that Mr. O'Cox's claim that he was protecting mice was merely his way of getting to eat them? The notion was astounding, but the more Poppy thought about it, the more it seemed to be so. It certainly explained things. That is, Mr. O'Cox's refusal to give permission for the mice to move to New House had nothing to do with what she and Ragweed had done. He had refused because he did not want the mice to know how fearful he was of losing his dinners. But if that was true, then the mice could come to New House whether Mr. O'Cox liked it or not. It was not for Mr. O'Cox to decide where they lived, but for the mice themselves. And oh, irony, if the family moved to New House, the fake owl would protect them. Poppy was so sure she had found the truth that she stood up on her hind legs, leaped into the air, and kicked her heels twice. When she landed, she collapsed into a soft heap and allowed herself a great sigh of contentment. With that, she closed her eyes and fell into a deep sleep. What a day! As Poppy slept, Mr. O'Cox flew in to settle on a branch along the edge of dim wood. From deep within the foliage, he stared furiously at the owl on the barn. And there she is sleeping. And that's the end of our chapters for today. Next week, we'll finish the book, starting with chapter 17, a surprising conversation. Will they move to the new house? Will she get the salt lick for Aerith? Check back next week. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.